The evening started like any other for the officer who had been on the road since noon. The sky was turning a deep shade of orange, and the long stretch of highway felt calm and predictable. He liked this time of day because the rush had faded and the road felt almost peaceful. It was the kind of shift where nothing unusual happened, and he expected it to stay that way. He drove at a steady pace, scanning the lanes out of habit rather than concern. As he reached a quiet section of the highway, he noticed a dark car ahead drifting slightly to one side. It wasn't enough to call it dangerous, but it was just off enough to get his attention. Sometimes it meant the driver was tired, and sometimes it meant they were distracted. Either way, he knew he should check. With a small sigh, he turned on his lights, expecting another simple talk, maybe a warning, and then sending someone on their way. He had done it 1,000 times. The car pulled over smoothly, not fast and not slow. The officer walked up to the driver's window, and the person inside lowered it halfway. The driver looked calm, almost too calm, as if trying hard to appear normal. The officer greeted them politely and asked for the usual documents. The driver hesitated for just a moment before handing them over. It wasn't much, just a tiny pause. But the officer noticed it. When he returned to his patrol car, he typed the license information into the system. At first, the screen looked normal, but then something unusual happened. A small message appeared at the top of the screen, one he had never seen before in all his years on the job. It said that the file was restricted and required special clearance to open. He stared at it, confused. Usually, the system gave full details instantly. This time, it gave almost nothing. He tried again, thinking it might be a glitch, but the same message appeared. The second time, another message followed, telling him the record was linked to a government security level far above anything he handled. His brows lifted in surprise. Ordinary drivers did not have files locked behind federal layers. The officer leaned back and looked at the car he had stopped. There was nothing unusual about it from the outside. It looked like any other car on a quiet road. Yet his computer was acting like he had pulled over someone important, someone connected to something he had no business knowing about. He took a slow breath, not wanting to jump to conclusions. Maybe the system was wrong. Maybe someone else had used the car. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Still, something didn't feel ordinary. When he walked back to the car, he tried to keep his voice steady and friendly. He asked the driver a few basic questions: where they were headed, if they were feeling tired, if everything was all right. The driver answered politely, but their words felt careful, almost chosen. They weren't nervous, but they weren't relaxed either. It was like they were trying to stay within a certain boundary. The officer noticed the driver kept glancing forward, not at him. It wasn't disrespectful, just unusual. Most people looked directly at him, either confused or worried. This person seemed focused on something else entirely. The officer returned to his patrol car again, unsure of what he should do next. The system had not given him any instructions except for a small alert at the bottom of the screen. It said that the person may be connected to a classified department and that he should proceed with caution. It didn't say why. It didn't say what level of caution. It just left him guessing. He sat there for a moment, trying to decide how to handle this. The road was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of passing cars in the distance. It felt strange to be stuck between a simple traffic stop and something far bigger than he understood. He didn't want to escalate things without a reason. He also didn't want to ignore a federal notice. He picked up his radio and called dispatch. He explained that he needed a verification check on the driver's identification. The person on the other end sounded normal at first, but when he read the alert message, the tone changed. The dispatcher asked him to repeat it, then told him to stand by. The wait felt longer than it actually was. The officer kept his eyes on the car. The driver remained still, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, as if they were used to waiting for things like this. That alone made the officer even more curious. Most drivers fidgeted, checked their phone, or looked around nervously. This one didn't. When dispatch finally responded, the officer expected a normal confirmation. Instead, he heard a tense voice telling him to step slightly back from the vehicle and wait for further instructions. The tone wasn't panicked, but it wasn't relaxed either. It carried weight, the kind that told him something unusual was happening. He ended the call and looked at the car again. He didn't want to scare the driver or make the situation bigger than it should be, so he stayed composed. Still, his heart beat a little faster than usual. This wasn't routine anymore. He walked back toward the front of his patrol car, stopping at a spot where he could still see everything clearly. The sun had dropped lower, and the sky was darker now. The air felt heavier, as if the road itself knew something unexpected was unfolding as he stood there. Watching the car and waiting for whatever came next, he felt a mix of confusion and curiosity. He had handled difficult stops before, but nothing with secret federal alerts attached. Nothing that made dispatch speak in that tone. He wondered who the driver really was, and why the system protected their information so tightly. He wondered what story sat behind that calm face and careful answers. He wondered why fate had placed him here on this road, on this night. At this exact moment, it had started as a simple, drifting vehicle. But now, the officer knew this was no ordinary traffic stop, and something told him that whatever came next would change the way he looked at. Routine days forever. The officer stayed near the front of his patrol car. Trying to look calm, even though the situation felt stranger by the minute, the sun had nearly disappeared, leaving only a faint glow across the sky. Streetlights along the highway flickered to life, casting long shadows across the pavement. Everything looked normal, but the tension he felt made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. The driver remained in the stopped car, his hands visible on the steering wheel. They didn't move, didn't fidget, and didn't show signs of worry. Instead, they sat very still, almost as if they were trained for situations like this. The stillness made the officer even more curious. He had seen all kinds of reactions during stops fear annoyance. Confusion, but never this kind of quiet control. A soft breeze brushed across the officer's face, but it did nothing to ease the uneasy feeling building inside him. He glanced at his patrol computer again, hoping the alert was a mistake, but the same message stared back at him: restricted access, high-level clearance required. He didn't know who could have that kind of protection except people tied to serious government work. He kept watching the car, while replaying everything in his mind: the slight drift on the road, the calm driver, the hesitation when handing over the documents, and then the alert. Together, they created a picture that didn't quite make sense yet. He wasn't scared, just unsure. Situations like this demanded patience, and patience sometimes felt harder than action. After a few minutes, he saw headlights approaching from behind. Two unmarked vehicles slowed down and stopped a short distance away. They didn't rush or make noise. They simply arrived with a quiet confidence that made the officer straighten his posture. The doors opened, and a few individuals stepped out. They weren't in uniforms, but their presence carried authority. They walked with a steady pace, not fast, but purposeful. The officer immediately knew they were federal agents. You didn't need badges to sense it. One of them approached him with a calm expression, offering a polite nod before speaking. The voice was steady, respectful, serious enough to make it clear this wasn't a simple check-in. They asked if he was the one who initiated the stop. He confirmed it. Then they asked him to describe everything he had seen, from the drifting car to the moment dispatch told him to step back. They listened closely, giving their full attention to his words. It felt strange to be the one answering questions during a routine stop, but the officer kept his voice level and honest. After hearing his explanation, one agent exchanged a glance with the others. It wasn't a look of alarm, but one that suggested they had expected something like this. The officer found himself wishing he knew what that look meant. Then one agent told him, in a low voice, that the driver he pulled over was connected to classified work related to the Pentagon. The officer felt a small shock run through him. He had never met anyone linked to something that important, especially not on a quiet highway. The agent continued, speaking carefully, avoiding details but making it clear that the driver was involved in sensitive assignments. The officer realized there was a reason for the drifting, the calm behavior, and the restricted record. Everything made more sense now, even though he still felt like he was staring at a puzzle missing half its pieces. The agents told the officer that when he entered the driver's information into the system, He activated a security alert that required immediate federal attention. They assured him he did nothing wrong. In fact, they said he handled everything exactly as he should have. Still, the officer couldn't help feeling slightly overwhelmed. He had pulled over many cars before, but never one that led to federal involvement. The agents then asked him to step aside while they approached the driver. The officer watched from a short distance as they went to the car. The driver lowered the window and handed over something small and metallic, a badge. But unlike any the officer had seen before, the agents examined it briefly, then returned it. They spoke to the driver quietly, their calm conversation lasting only a few minutes. The officer wished he could hear what they were saying, but he knew better than to move closer. Whatever they were discussing wasn't meant for him. After speaking with the driver, the agents returned to the officer. One of them explained that the driver was currently part of a mission that required close monitoring, and the stop had triggered a protocol designed to ensure nothing compromised that mission. The officer nodded slowly, trying to absorb everything. He asked if the driver had done anything wrong. The agent shook his head. "No," he said. "But people in certain positions can't move freely without raising internal alerts. Your stop wasn't expected tonight, so it was taken seriously." The officer understood. At least he understood as much as he could without being told the full story. He didn't expect them to tell him more anyway. Classified meant classified. The driver eventually stepped out of the car. They looked tired, not physically, but mentally, as if carrying a weight the officer couldn't imagine. They offered a polite apology, saying the drifting was unintentional and caused by urgent thoughts they couldn't share. Their tone was honest, and the officer believed them. The driver then thanked the officer for being professional and calm. It was rare to receive appreciation during a stop, and for a moment, the officer felt a small sense of pride. Even in a strange situation like this, his training had guided him well. The agents reviewed the driver's planned route and then cleared them to continue. The officer watched as the car re-entered the highway, blending into the night as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something significant. The officer knew it. The agents knew it. Even the quiet road seemed to know it. One of the agents approached the officer one last time. They spoke softly, almost as if choosing every word with care. "You handled this well," the agent said. "There are things we can't explain, but your attention tonight helped keep everything in the right direction." Then they added something that stayed in the officer's mind. Sometimes routine moments connect to bigger things. You won't always know why, but they matter. When the agents finally left, the officer stood alone beside his patrol car, the night quieter than before. He felt different, not shaken, but aware. Aware that behind the simple things he saw every day, bigger stories existed. Stories he might never fully understand. He climbed back into his car and sat for a moment, letting everything sink in. The road stretched ahead, calm again, as if waiting for him to continue his shift. He took a deep breath and turned the ignition. Whatever came next, he knew this night would stay with him for a long time. The night felt different now. Heavier, as if the air itself carried secrets that the officer wasn't supposed to know. After the driver left and the unmarked vehicles pulled away, the officer remained alone on the quiet stretch of highway. He wasn't sure whether to move on with his shift or wait for some final instruction. A part of him hoped things would return to normal, but deep down, he knew nothing about this night would feel normal again. He sat in his patrol car for a moment, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel as he replayed everything that had happened. It had all escalated so quickly. One moment he was pulling over a drifting car, and the next he was standing face to face with federal agents. He kept wondering if he had done something wrong. Even though the agents insisted he hadn't, still, the feeling lingered. Before he could collect his thoughts fully, his radio crackled to life. Dispatch told him that he should stay at his location a little longer. Their tone was steady, but he could hear a slight uncertainty behind it. The kind that suggested they were passing along instructions they didn't fully understand either. While he waited, he watched headlights appear far down the road. Another set of unmarked vehicles was approaching. He recognized the way they drove, smooth, steady, and intentional. These weren't ordinary drivers. These were people who moved with a purpose. The vehicle stopped near him, and several individuals stepped out. Their posture alone told him they were part of the same federal group he had seen earlier. They approached him calmly, not in a rush, but with a focus that made his pulse quicken again. One of them greeted him and asked, he was the officer involved in the earlier stop. He nodded. Even though they already knew, they still asked as a formality, or maybe out of respect. These people never wasted words. They told him they needed more details. Not because he did anything wrong, but because what he saw might matter in ways he didn't yet understand. The officer tried to explain everything clearly: the drifting, the cautious answers, the tension in the driver's voice, and even the way the driver's eyes kept checking the road ahead. He didn't know which details were important, but he shared them all. The group listened carefully, not interrupting once. Their quiet attention made him feel like every word he said carried weight. When he finished, one of them stepped aside to make a quick call. The others waited, exchanging brief glances but staying silent. After a moment, the agent returned and thanked the officer again. Then they explained something that made his stomach tighten. The driver he had stopped was more than simply connected to high-level work. They were part of an operation that had been under extreme pressure in recent weeks. Any unexpected delay, change in movement, or interruption could cause ripple effects that the officer couldn't imagine. Hearing this, the officer felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt for pulling the driver over at all, even though he had only been doing his job. Relief because the agents didn't blame him. They only needed to understand how the stop happened. Then something unexpected happened. The driver returned. A vehicle he hadn't noticed before approached slowly, headlights dimmed. It stopped near the agents, and the door opened. The driver stepped out, looking calmer now, but still carrying the weight of whatever mission they were tied to. They walked up to the officer with a calm expression, but he could see tiredness in their eyes, tiredness that didn't come from lack of sleep but from carrying a burden too heavy to talk about. The driver thanked the officer again, this time more sincerely. They explained that the drifting wasn't due to distraction or carelessness. They had been dealing with a stressful situation tied to their assignment, something that made their mind race even while driving. They apologized if their behavior had seemed unusual. The officer nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. Even though he still didn't know the full story, hearing from the driver directly made the situation feel more human. It reminded him that behind every badge, every role, and every title, there was still a person. Someone who could feel pressure, fear, and responsibility. The agents then asked the officer and the driver to step aside while they had a separate discussion. The officer couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could sense the seriousness of their conversation. The agents spoke softly, their expressions carefully controlled. The driver listened closely, occasionally nodding. When they finished, the group regrouped near the patrol car. The lead agent explained that the driver needed to be escorted to a secure location to complete the next part of their assignment. They also needed to verify that nothing during the stop had compromised any ongoing work. The officer felt a small wave of worry. Had his stop caused a delay? Had he unknowingly created a problem? But the agent reassured him that everything was still on track. If anything, the stop helped confirm that the driver was safe and moving according to protocol. The officer watched as two agents returned to their vehicles and prepared to escort the driver. The quiet road, which had felt ordinary only an hour earlier, now felt like the backdrop of something far larger than he could comprehend. Before leaving, the lead agent approached him again. Their voice was calm but carried a tone that felt almost personal. They told the officer that he had played a small but meaningful role that night. They reminded him that sometimes people doing their everyday jobs ended up crossing paths with others, carrying extraordinary responsibilities. The officer didn't know how to respond except to nod respectfully. He wasn't used to being part of anything secretive or intense. His job was about keeping the roads safe, not stepping into national-level events. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a highway, being thanked for something he didn't fully understand. As the agents and the driver prepared to leave, the lead agent added one last thing. If someone asks why you were delayed tonight, tell them it was just another routine stop. The true story stays here. The officer watched them leave, their vehicles disappearing into the night with a quiet smoothness that made the road feel empty again. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This one felt deeper. He stood there for a few moments, letting the cool night air settle around him. He tried to steady his thoughts, telling himself to focus on the rest of his shift. But the truth was, the shift didn't feel the same anymore. Something inside him had changed when he finally climbed back into his patrol car. He took one last look at the stretch of road where everything had unfolded. It looked peaceful and ordinary, yet, behind that calm appearance, something unforgettable had taken place. As he drove away, he realized that some nights were just nights, but others carried moments that stayed with a person forever. The officer drove slowly down the highway, still caught between the calmness of the night and the weight of what he had just witnessed. Even though he had been cleared to continue his shift, his mind didn't move on as easily as his patrol car did. The road felt familiar, but his thoughts didn't. It was as if he had stepped into a world he never knew existed, only to be pushed back out just as quickly. A few miles down, he pulled over near a rest area to take a moment and breathe. He turned off the engine, letting the quiet night settle around him. The only sounds were distant traffic and the soft rustling of trees. Normally, this kind of stillness helped him clear his mind. But tonight, it only reminded him of the silence the agents carried with them, silence that held so much he would never know. He leaned back against his seat, staring out the windshield. He replayed the moment when the driver returned with the agents. There had been something in the driver's eyes, something he couldn't quite describe. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something deeper, like they were carrying a responsibility too heavy to share. He wondered what kind of job required that level of secrecy. He had dealt with important people before, but nothing like this. Not someone connected to the kind of work whispered rather than spoken. After a few minutes of quiet reflection, his radio buzzed softly. Dispatch asked if he was okay and reminded him he could take a short break if needed. Their voice held a softness he wasn't used to hearing. Somehow, they must have sensed the night had become more than routine. He appreciated the concern, but assured them he was fine. He wasn't shaken, just thoughtful. After finishing a small drink he kept in the car, he turned the engine back on and continued driving. The highway seemed even emptier than before, stretching endlessly under the dim glow of streetlights. He found himself searching the road ahead more carefully, noticing details he normally would have ignored. Maybe he felt more alert now, knowing that hidden stories could pass by him at any time. Just when he thought the night might settle back into its usual rhythm, something caught his eye. A familiar car was parked on the side of an off-ramp, barely visible in the shadows. He slowed down, recognizing the shape immediately. It was the same dark vehicle the driver had been in earlier. His heart tightened slightly. Why were they stopped again? Was something wrong? He pulled over behind the car and stepped out, approaching carefully but calmly. The driver was standing outside this time, leaning against the side as if trying to catch their breath. They looked up as the officer approached, their expressions softer but strained. "Everything all right?" the officer asked gently. The driver took a moment before nodding. They explained that after moving forward with the escort, they had received a sudden update from their team. It wasn't bad news, but it required immediate communication. They had pulled over to send a secure message. The officer didn't fully understand what that meant, but he listened with patience. He noticed the driver's hands were slightly unsteadied, not from fear, but from carrying too much pressure. The driver then did something unexpected. They shared a small portion of their situation, not enough to reveal anything confidential, but enough to help the officer understand the weight they were under. They spoke about the difficulty of living a life where almost everything had to be hidden, about the responsibility of making decisions that could affect people far beyond themselves, about the loneliness that came with carrying secrets you couldn't share with family or friends. They didn't use dramatic words. They didn't complain. They simply shared a human truth the officer had never considered. The officer listened quietly, realizing he had never thought about the emotional cost of such a job. To the world, people connected to agencies or secure departments always look strong and untouchable. But standing here, the officer saw a real person, someone doing their best under pressures most people would never face. The driver went on to explain that the drifting earlier had come from hours of nonstop decisions and messages. They hadn't meant to seem suspicious or distant. They had simply been overwhelmed by the weight of the job. Hearing this, the officer felt a wave of understanding wash over him. He realized that sometimes people in powerful positions weren't avoiding others. They were carrying burdens too heavy to show. The driver took a deep breath, visibly calmer now that they had spoken openly, even if only a little. They thanked the officer once more for how calmly he had handled everything. They said not everyone would have been so patient or respectful. The officer shook his head slightly. "Just doing my job," he said. But deep down, he felt humbled. Before climbing back into their car, the driver pulled out a small metallic badge, the one he had seen earlier with the agents. They glanced at it, then held it gently for a moment, as if it represented something heavy. They told the officer that carrying such a badge wasn't always a sign of power. Sometimes it was a reminder of responsibility, sacrifice, and difficult choices. They spoke about how people often saw only the surface of their roles, never the sleepless nights or the emotional strain. The officer nodded in quiet respect. He understood now that the drifting car wasn't about carelessness, and the guarded answers weren't about hiding danger. They were signs of a person trying to hold themselves together under pressure. Before leaving, the driver said one final thing that stayed with the officer long after they drove away. They said, "You only saw a small moment of my life tonight, but you handled that moment with kindness. Sometimes that's all someone needs to keep going." The officer watched as they got back into their vehicle and drove off, disappearing into the night once more. This time, he didn't feel confused or overwhelmed. He felt a deep sense of connection, a reminder that every person on the road had a story, known or unknown. He returned to his patrol car, sitting for a moment before turning the key. The night felt calmer now, not because the tension had vanished, but because he understood it differently. He drove slowly at first, letting the thoughts settle. The road stretched ahead, quiet and open. He felt lighter in a strange way, knowing he had been able to offer someone even a small moment of support. He continued his patrol. But the night no longer felt ordinary. The experience had opened his eyes to the hidden struggles people carried, and as he moved forward, he realized that being an officer wasn't only about enforcing rules. It was also about seeing people for who they were, humans, trying their best in a complicated world. The morning felt calm, almost a calm, as the officer drove into town for the final meeting he had promised to attend. After everything that had happened, he felt as if life had shifted around him, like the world had shown a side he never expected to see. Even though he tried to move normally, something inside him had changed. He carried a new weight, but also a new understanding of what people carried behind their quiet faces. He parked near a small cafe, where he was supposed to meet the person from the Pentagon. The request to meet again had surprised him. He had assumed the investigation was done, and that everything had been settled when the real story came out. But the message he received was clear and strangely calm. They wanted to talk in person, one last time. He stepped out of the car, trying not to overthink it. Still, his mind kept circling around what this meeting could mean. When he entered the cafe, it was nearly empty. Soft music played in the background, and a few people were lost in their own conversations. The person he came to meet sat at a table in the corner, waiting quietly. There was nothing dramatic about their presence. That alone made him relax a little. They nodded for him to sit, and he took the seat across from them. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt more like a pause before a new chapter. Finally, the person leaned forward slightly and thanked him again for the night he chose to stop the car. They said if he hadn't done it, things could have turned out very differently. Even though the young driver he pulled over was innocent, the information recovered that night had helped them uncover something important, something larger than either of them had expected. The officer listened closely, realizing this meeting was more than a simple goodbye. The conversation slowly shifted to what drove him to act the way he did, why he chose patience instead of quick decisions, why he listened instead of assuming the worst. He explained that he had seen too many situations go wrong because someone acted too fast. He had learned over time that slowing down often revealed the truth. The person across the table nodded, saying not many officers handled situations that way. They appreciated his calm nature, his fairness, his willingness to see a person instead of a threat. He didn't know what to say at first. Compliments weren't something he was used to, but he appreciated the words all the same. Then the tone changed just slightly, becoming more serious. The person told him that there were people in high places who respected how he handled everything and wanted to offer him something. They slid a small envelope across the table. He hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a letter, simple but official. It offered him a chance to train with a special program, one focused on crisis negotiation and communication. It wasn't a transfer. It wasn't a new job. It was a chance to grow, to learn, to be part of something that required patience, understanding, and calm hearts. It was exactly the kind of work he believed in. They said the offer came because he had shown qualities that couldn't be taught, only recognized. He looked down at the letter for a long moment. The offer surprised him, but at the same time, it felt strangely right, like his entire career had been steering him toward something bigger than routine patrols. He thanked them, saying he would think about it carefully. They smiled, telling him there was no rush. The path he chose would be respected either way. Before leaving, they extended their hand. When he shook it, he felt a quiet sense of closure. When the meeting ended, he stepped outside into the sunlight. The day felt brighter than before, and he stood for a moment just taking it in. As he walked toward his car, he replayed everything that had happened over the past nights. From the unexpected traffic stop, to the fear in the young driver's eyes, to the strange string of events that followed, every piece formed a picture he would never forget. He got into his car and sat quietly behind the wheel. The streets around him moved like normal. People going about their lives without knowing how close something big had come to passing right through their town. He took a long breath and felt the weight of the letter in his pocket. He didn't decide right away. Instead, he drove through the town, watching familiar places blur past the windows. It reminded him of why he became an officer in the first place. He believed every person deserved to be heard, even in tense moments. If he chose the new path, he knew he would be helping people on a deeper level. Later in the afternoon, he parked by a quiet lake just outside of town. The place had always helped him think. The water was still, the reflection of the sky stretching across the surface like a painting. He sat on a bench and pulled the letter out again. Reading it slowly, he thought about the young driver, how frightened they were, how everything could have turned into a misunderstanding if he had reacted differently. The thought made him shiver. It also reminded him of the importance of staying steady. Even when things escalated, the lake breeze moved softly through the trees as he sat there. By the time the sun began to dip, his mind felt clearer. The path in front of him no longer felt confusing. It felt natural. He stood, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back into his pocket. Then he headed to his car with a calm sense of purpose. He didn't need to announce his decision to anyone yet. He just knew, deep down, that he would accept the offer. Not for praise, not for recognition, but because it aligned with the person he had always tried to be. By the time he drove away from the lake, the world around him looked the same, but he didn't feel the same. He felt ready. Ready. For what came next? Ready for whatever path his choice would open, and ready to carry the lessons of that night for the rest of his life.